In the dense forests of Upper Canada, a warrior fell, and with him, the last real hope of a united Native American resistance. This isn't just the story of a battle. It's the unraveling of an alliance, the death of a legend, and a moment that reshaped the fate of the American Midwest. This is the Battle of the Thames, the forgotten fight that silenced Tecumseh and broke the British hold on the Northwest. If you haven't heard this story, it's because history buried it. But today, we dig it up. By 1813, North America was burning with conflict. The War of 1812 was raging, pitting the young United States against the British Empire once more. But this wasn't just a war between two nations. It was a war for the very future of the continent. At the heart of it all was the Northwest Territory, a vast stretch of contested land that included parts of modern-day Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, and Ontario. For the United States, this was frontier land ripe for expansion. For Britain, it was a critical buffer zone against American aggression. But for Tecumseh, leader of the Shawnee, it was sacred ground, and he was prepared to die defending it. Tecumseh wasn't just another tribal chief. He was a visionary, an orator and strategist who had spent years building a native confederacy from the Great Lakes to the Mississippi. His dream? A united indigenous front powerful enough to stop the encroaching wave of American settlers. To achieve this, Tecumseh allied with the British. They needed warriors, and he needed guns. His forces played a key role in early British victories, including the stunning surrender of Detroit. But the alliance was fragile. The British saw Tecumseh as useful, brave, yes, but expendable, and that tension was about to boil over. Meanwhile, on the American side, a rising political figure was preparing to make his name in blood. General William Henry Harrison. A veteran of frontier wars, Harrison was ambitious and eager to crush both the British and their native allies. He had fought Tecumseh's brother at Tippecanoe in 1811, and now he wanted the other half of the story. The lines were drawn. The British and native forces were retreating up the Thames River, trying to escape a pursuing American army. But Tecumseh wasn't the kind of man to run. He would stand, and he would fight. As the leaves began to fall in October of 1813, British forces under Major General Henry Procter were in full retreat. After the American victory at the Battle of Lake Erie, the entire British position in Upper Canada was collapsing. With their supply lines cut off, and the Royal Navy driven from the lake, Procter's only option was to fall back along the Thames River and hope to regroup. But the retreat was a disaster from the start. Procter was an officer by title, but not by heart. He lacked the decisiveness, charisma, and courage needed for wartime leadership. His soldiers were demoralized, starving, and angry. Supplies were dwindling. Desertions increased. Morale fell apart. Meanwhile, Tecumseh, ever the warrior, was furious. He had trusted the British to stand and fight, but what he saw was cowardice. In his eyes, Procter had broken a sacred promise, not just to his men, but to the entire native alliance. He confronted Procter more than once, demanding that they make a stand. His words were scathing, his tone uncompromising. "Listen, our warriors are brave. Let us show the Americans we will not run like dogs. Let us fight." But Procter wouldn't listen. He kept retreating. Tecumseh faced an impossible choice: abandon the British and protect what remained of his warriors, or stand with them, even if it meant walking into a trap. In the end, his sense of honor prevailed. If the British were to fall, he would fall with them. Meanwhile, General Harrison was closing in, with a force of nearly 3,500 men, regulars and Kentucky militia. He moved quickly along the river, cutting through the wilderness and pressing the enemy's heels. His goal wasn't just to win a battle, he wanted vengeance, he wanted glory, and he wanted Tecumseh. The British finally halted near Moraviantown, a small settlement along the Thames River. There, Procter decided, too late, that they would make a stand. But by then, his men were half-starved, poorly armed, and exhausted. The battlefield offered no strategic advantage. There were no trenches, no defenses, just open fields and woods. Tecumseh, despite his rage, prepared his warriors for what he knew could be their final stand. He positioned them in a thick swamp to the left of the British line, where their style of ambush and guerrilla warfare could still prove deadly. He reportedly told his men that morning, "We must fight. We must defend the bones of our fathers." They would not retreat. Not again. On the morning of October 5th, 1813, the rising mist clung to the damp earth near Moraviantown. The British troops, numbering fewer than 900, stood weakly in formation across an open field, while Tecumseh's 500 warriors waited silently in the thick woods and swamp to their left. They had no artillery. Few had bayonets. Some carried outdated muskets. Others only tomahawks or clubs. Across the field, the American forces arrived. General William Henry Harrison at their head, his troops freshly supplied, better armed, and well-fed. He had over 3,000 soldiers, including highly motivated Kentucky militia under Colonel Richard Mentor Johnson, who burned with a personal hatred for Tecumseh, blaming him for attacks on frontier settlements. Harrison split his force, directing Colonel Johnson to lead a bold cavalry charge directly into the center of the British line. The British regulars, already starving and demoralized, barely fired a volley before collapsing under pressure. Some threw down their weapons. Others fled. Within minutes, the British position crumbled. Procter, true to form, abandoned his men. He fled on horseback, leaving Tecumseh and his warriors to face the full brunt of the American army alone. But Tecumseh did not move. Instead, he prepared his warriors for what would become the final act of his life. In the swamp, the native force resisted with fierce tenacity. They used trees and underbrush as cover, unleashing gunfire and surprise attacks on the advancing Americans. And then came the cavalry. Johnson's mounted soldiers plunged into the swamp, an act of desperation and bravado. Visibility was low, horses stumbled, but Johnson charged ahead, personally leading the assault into Tecumseh's position. In the chaos, a fierce exchange erupted. According to some accounts, Tecumseh and Johnson may have faced each other directly, though this remains a matter of legend. What is known, Tecumseh was killed in that swamp. No one can say with certainty who fired the fatal shot. Some credited Colonel Johnson, though evidence was flimsy and politically convenient. He would later use the claim to launch a vice presidential campaign. Others believe it was a random shot in the fury of battle. What mattered most was that Tecumseh, the last unifying voice among the eastern woodlands tribes, was dead. His body, never officially identified, was reportedly stripped, mutilated, and buried in an unmarked grave by American soldiers. The moment his warriors learned of his death, they broke off the fight and vanished into the forest. The native resistance in the Northwest collapsed that day. Without Tecumseh, the Confederacy fell apart. The Battle of the Thames was over. When the smoke cleared at Moraviantown, what remained was not a field of glory, but one of eerie quiet. The British had been routed. Their commander, Henry Procter, was later court-martialed for his cowardice and disgrace, and the once unified native Confederacy was shattered beyond repair. The American victory at the Thames was swift, almost anticlimactic, Harrison had accomplished everything he set out to do. He crushed the British presence in the Northwest, ended the native resistance in the region, and claimed a high-profile battlefield success that would catapult him into national fame. Yet, despite this, the true cost of the battle wasn't fully understood until long after the guns had fallen silent. The native tribes of the Ohio Valley, the Great Lakes, and the Mississippi River Basin had lost their strongest political and spiritual leader. Tecumseh had been the rare unifier, one of the few figures who could bridge tribal divisions and speak with one voice against the creeping advance of American settlers. With his death, so too died the vision of a permanent native nation east of the Mississippi. Many tribes, now without centralized leadership or British support, began signing individual treaties with the U.S. government. One by one, ancestral lands were ceded. The Treaty of Greenville, the Treaty of Fort Meigs, the Treaty of Detroit, each a nail in the coffin of native sovereignty in the Midwest. And yet, the British, whose promises had helped lure Tecumseh into the war, retreated back into Canada, offering no defense, no support, and no recompense to their former native allies. It was a betrayal that echoed for generations. Tecumseh's body was never formally identified. It's said that he was buried by his own men in secret, in an unmarked grave somewhere near the swamp where he fell, hidden as if to protect him from the indignity of American trophies. But his absence became louder than his presence had ever been. Stories about his death began to circulate wildly. Some claimed he had cursed the land. Others believed his spirit still watched over the rivers and woods of the Ohio Valley. In time, Tecumseh passed into the realm of myth, his real accomplishments obscured by legend. Long after the war had ended, and the last treaties had been signed, the memory of Tecumseh refused to fade. Though he died on the losing side of a forgotten frontier, his image only grew, warped, romanticized, exploited, until he became more symbol than man. In the United States, the transformation began almost immediately. Colonel Richard Mentor Johnson, the man who claimed to have killed Tecumseh, turned the native leader's death into a political prop. In campaign posters, Johnson was branded as Tecumseh's Slayer, a war hero who had ended the threat of native resistance. It was an effective narrative. He would later become vice president under Martin Van Buren. But many Americans viewed Tecumseh with reluctant respect. He was the so-called noble enemy, brave, intelligent, and fiercely loyal to his people. Unlike other native leaders who were demonized in the press, Tecumseh was often described in elevated terms: a warrior statesman, a philosopher in feathers, a leader without equal. It was easier for Americans to admire him once he was gone, once his cause had failed. Among Native Americans, Tecumseh became a martyr. In the oral histories of the Shawnee, Delaware, Potawatomi, and Miami peoples, Tecumseh was not just a chief or a general, he was a prophet of unity. His dream of a pan-tribal nation had come painfully close to realization. His discipline, his eloquence, and his refusal to surrender became the benchmark for indigenous resistance. Even in Canada, where the battle occurred, Tecumseh was remembered as a hero who fought to defend the frontier. Statues were erected in his honor, towns and schools were named after him. He was celebrated by some as a symbol of the British Indigenous Alliance, though the truth was far more complicated, and his betrayal by the British never forgotten by native communities. Historians, too, began to dig deeper. They uncovered letters, journals, and diplomatic records. They found Tecumseh's speeches, bold declarations made to white and native audiences alike. His warning to the Americans, "You buy land from men who have no right to sell it," echoed through time. He had not simply fought for territory, he had fought for a vision that the land belonged to all tribes collectively, and could not be sold by one without the consent of all. That vision was revolutionary. Even today, it stands as a challenge to colonial systems of ownership and power. But Tecumseh's greatest legacy may be the standard he set. Future Native leaders, from Sitting Bull to Geronimo, would draw inspiration from his resolve. Even activists in the 20th and 21st centuries invoke his name as a symbol of resistance, dignity, and unity. He was more than a casualty of war. He became a timeless figure, resurrected in memory every time Indigenous people rose to defend their rights, their lands, and their identity. The Battle of the Thames was more than a clash of armies. It was a fracture in the course of North American history. The ripples from that battlefield, soaked in blood and betrayal, would shape the destiny of a continent. For the United States, the battle marked a symbolic turning point. It cemented the rise of William Henry Harrison as a national figure. He would later ride the momentum of this and earlier victories to the presidency under the slogan, "Tippecanoe and Tyler too," though he would die only 31 days into his term. The war itself, a forgotten conflict wedged between the Revolutionary War and the Civil War, produced few clear gains. But politically, it ignited a wave of nationalist pride. The defeat of Tecumseh and the retreat of the British gave Americans the illusion of control over the western frontier, sparking further settlement into what had once been sovereign native lands. For the British, the aftermath was tinged with shame. General Henry Procter, whose incompetence and cowardice doomed his forces, was court-martialed and suspended. The British Crown never honored its promises to the native allies. They chose diplomacy over resistance and quietly abandoned their obligations. It was a decision driven by political survival, but one that would leave a lasting scar on Indigenous relations with the Crown. And for Native Americans, the consequences were catastrophic. Without Tecumseh, the dream of a unified resistance collapsed. His confederacy disintegrated. Many tribes were forced into unfair treaties, often under duress or through manipulation. The land cessions came rapidly. By the 1830s, the Indian Removal Act would force entire nations westward, away from the forests, rivers, and plains they had called home for centuries. The Battle of the Thames, then, was not a triumph of military genius. It was the silencing of a vision. And yet, Tecumseh's voice still resonates. Across North America, statues of Tecumseh stand in quiet dignity. His words are still quoted in history classrooms and political speeches. His story continues to inspire not just Native communities, but all who resist erasure, all who speak for unity in the face of division. To walk the field at Moraviantown today is to stand at a crossroads between what was, what could have been, and what remains. The birds still call, the river still moves, and the legacy of one man, warrior, visionary, diplomat, still lingers in the soil. The Battle of the Thames ended in blood. But the story of Tecumseh never truly ended. It became legend, and legends, as history teaches us, never die.